Prince Maurits of Orange was ill, very ill. English ambassador Sir Dudley Carleton described the stadtholder as completely broken. But the war waited for no one. Commander-in-Chief of the royal forces in the Spanish Netherlands, Ambrogio Spinola Doria, Marques de los Balbasis, finally got permission from King Felipe IV's Governors-General Isabel de Austria to besiege the strategically located Breda, Prince Maurits's barony. Spinola arrived at Breda with 40,000 men, seized vital towns in the area, built a circumvallation and a contravallation line, and placed over 30 cannons. Europe watched with bated breath for Maurits, commander-in-chief of the Republican forces, to ride out and face off with Spinola. Breda's governor, Justinus van Nassau, Prince Maurits' 65-year-old illegitimate half-brother, led a top-notch garrison of 7,000 men. The town had food and weapons for 9 months, and Justinus figured he'd wear down the besiegers while awaiting the relief force. To save food, the governor sent several companies to Geertruidenberg, leaving him with about 5,200 soldiers and 1,800 armed citizens. Marquis Spinola, faced with a Nassau brother, knew a bribe or a ruse wasn't an option. He had to either storm the place or starve it out. The Marquis decided on the latter and locked the town in. During the first month, the Breda garrison sortied every other day to disrupt the construction of Spinola's defensive lines, and the state's cavalry stationed in Wau frequently raided the Spanish convoys. Spinola ordered tunnels to be dug to undermine the city walls and speed up the town's surrender. However, Governor Justinus ordered countermining and disabled most efforts. FYI, tunneling at this siege of Breda is featured in the Spanish movie A la Triste with actor Viggo Mortensen, based on the novels by Arturo Pérez Reverte. On September 30th, Prince Maurits arrived at Made with 25,000 foot and 2,400 horse. He dug a trench toward the Spanish circumvallation line, but had no intention of breaking the siege. The States General asked, begged and pleaded, but the prince said no. This kind of warfare required a lot of money. Maurits had the authority in the Republic, but he still depended on regents to keep the city stable, collect taxes, and gather the financial resources so the state and the army could function. But the war costs were massive, and it became harder to get the city government to approve the new taxes to pay for it. Well, no money, no sieges, no breaking of sieges. All Maurits was willing to do was destroy Spinola's supply lines to starve out the Spanish army. But when Nassau cousin Count Hendrik van den Berg joined Spinola and was made commander of the supply corridor, Maurits knew if he wanted to do some real damage, he had to take Antwerp. Not with a siege, but with a ruse. The Steen van Vlaanderen, Antwerp Castle, was guarded by about 80 royal soldiers who were either ill or too old to join the Breda siege. On October 13, 1624, Willem van der Rijt, Lord of Bruchem, the bailiff of Bergen-op-Zoom, led 2,000 foot and 200 horse. Everyone exchanged their blue or orange sashes for the Spanish red ones and painted burgundy crosses on their carriages and wagons, holding equipment to scale the Antwerp castle walls. They told every peasant they met on their way that they were bringing supplies to Antwerp. They arrived in the middle of a pitch-black night and downwind. However, an old soldier on patrol heard something and fired his musket, awakening the garrison, who rushed out to defend the town. The state soldiers bailed, leaving their barges, ladders, and tools behind. On October 22nd, Prince Maurits withdrew to more strategic places to raid the Spanish convoys. The prince and his cousin, Count Ernst Casimir van Nassau-Dietz, dug in at Roosendaal. Maurits' half-brother, Count Frederik Hendrik van Nassau, dug in at Waalwijk. Both destroyed the mills, ovens, and breweries for miles around, and gradually the Spanish camp started running low on food and supplies. But by November 1624, Prince Maurits was too ill to stay at camp and returned to The Hague. The Captain General was confined to his bedroom. He lost 50 pounds, but appeared otherwise healthy. The prince continued conducting state's business and jealously guarded his power and authority. When the States General dared to suggest he give military command to his brother, the Captain General flew into such a rage that everyone just stayed away from his darkened chambers. Maurits sent the governor of Grave, Lieutenant General Thomas van Stakenbroek, on another midnight run on Antwerp. But due to a torrential downpour, the soldiers' gunpowder became wet. And when they saw every bastion lit up like a Christmas tree, they figured their plans had leaked and retreated. Meanwhile, Lambert Charles, governor of Nijmegen, who you may remember from the surprise of Breda, had heard that a section of the city wall of Goch in the neutral territory in Germany had collapsed. They hadn't palisaded the breach and instead used the gap to bring sheep inside the ramparts. Charles decided to seize the place by surprise and gathered 1,200 men. Governor of Goch, Jacob Toerland, commanding a garrison of 1,200, warned other towns, but wasn't worried himself. He should have been. At 5 in the morning on January 27, 1625, Lambert Charles arrived at Goch and entered the city through the breach. The guards immediately fled to the castle on the other side of the town, followed by Jacob Toerland and his soldiers. The governor sent for help from Wesel's governor Juan González. The next day, 1,000 reinforcements approached the castle from the rear. However, when they crossed an emergency bridge, it collapsed under their weight. Then, during a sortie, Toerland was shot in the abdomen, and the officers surrendered. The States were pleased with the capture of Goch, but it did nothing to the siege of Breda. In January 1625, Prince Maurits finally allowed Count Frederik Hendrik to conduct military business on his behalf. But he never gave his brother full command. The Count immediately got to work and convinced the States to increase the army size. Frederik Hendrik now commanded over 40,000 foot and horse, which included Count Peter Ernst von Mansfeld's army of raw and poor rascals who had sailed over from Dover, England. But when the Count presented Maurits with relief plans for Breda, the prince simply answered, "Do what you want, for all I care. I don't want to." King James I of England suffered from arthritis, gout and kidney stones. He had lost his teeth and drank heavily. The king's favorite, George Villiers, the Duke of Buckingham, had his mom take care of him, though she did a terrible job. In December 1624, James's son, Prince Charles of Wales, announced his betrothal to Henriette Marie de France, the youngest daughter of the late King Henri IV, a Roman Catholic French woman then. Everyone was mad. By March 1625, Prince Maurits had gotten so ill that he could only eat and sleep with powerful medications. On March 23rd, Maurits asked his heir, Count Frederik Hendrik, who was preparing to relieve Breda, to come to The Hague at once. The prince had 7 bastard children but wasn't married. The 41-year-old Frederik Hendrik was also unmarried and had also fathered several bastard children. 6 months earlier, he had acknowledged one of his illegitimate sons, Frederik, the future Lord of Nassau-Zuilenstein, but he had no proper heirs. Maurits didn't believe his brother's assurances that he would one day marry and demanded Frederik Hendrik get married right this instant to secure the House of Orange-Nassau. If he refused, he'd inherit nothing, because Maurits would finally marry Margarethe van Mechelen and legitimize his 2 eldest sons, Willem and Lodewijk. It would damage the reputation of the Nassau house, but so be it. Maurits suggested his brother marry his current mistress, the 22-year-old German Amalia zu Solms-Braunfels. She was a former lady-in-waiting of, and best friends with, Queen Elizabeth of Bohemia, the Winter Queen. The woman didn't have a dime to her name, but she had the right faith, rank, and a decent lineage. Her grandmother was their father, Prince Willem of Orange's sister. With vast territories and millions of guilders on the line, Frederik Hendrik was like, "Get me to church!" Amalia's family didn't object, and the Count obtained the States General's permission. On April 4th, 1625, Frederik Hendrik and Amalia got married in the cloister church in The Hague. His mom wasn't there, as Louise de Coligny had already died in 1620. 2 days later, in Hertfordshire, England, early morning on April 6th, or March 27th English calendar, King James died after a stroke. He was 58 years old. His 24-year-old son was now King Charles I of England, Scotland, and Ireland. Charles and his new bestie, the Duke of Buckingham, immediately went to work. Charles vowed to create a European League to restore the Pfalz and his brother-in-law Friedrich V and help the Protestants in Germany. His father had often threatened to fight Spain, and Parliament seemed willing to support it, so King Charles declared war on Spain, expecting Parliament to give him all the money. Holy Roman Emperor Ferdinand II continued to wage war against Protestant rebels in the Habsburg Empire. When Albrecht Wenzel Eusebius von Wallenstein pledged his army of 50,000 men to the emperor in exchange for the right to plunder captured Protestant territories, Ferdinand immediately made him general of the imperial forces and asked him to conquer the north. Kurfürst Johann Georg von Sachsen and Georg Wilhelm von Brandenburg were like, "Somebody help!" Oh. One of the northern Habsburg territories under threat was the Duchy of Holstein, and the Duke of Holstein happened to be Christian IV, Konge of Denmark aan Nooie. When he heard Wallenstein was coming and the Protestant rulers were MIA, the King of Denmark was like, "To the ships!" But the Danish State Council, Rigsrådet, didn't want the king to mess in the Habsburg War and withheld funds, as was their right. However, Christian decided to use his own money and foreign subsidies to defend his lands. The Rigsraad could only issue a warning that such a war in Germany would only lead to the absolute ruin of the king and his subjects. France was on the warpath as well. King Louis XIII of France, eager to reduce Spain's ever-growing influence in northern Italy, invoked the Treaty of Compiègne with the Republic and the Mutual Assistance Treaty with England to help him honor his Treaty of Paris with Charles-Emmanuel, the Duke of Savoy, who was waging the First Genoese-Savoyard War while he unleashed the Valtellina War. Yeah. Anyway, the Republic was happy to help France since the two wars opened up another front for the Spanish. It also cut off the Spanish road's southern end, which was used to bring troops and supplies to the Spanish Netherlands. But just as Lieutenant Admiral Willem de Zoeteloord de Vauthin was about to set sail for Genoa to fend off a Spanish fleet, his orders changed. King Louis needed him to attack the Protestants in France instead. Wait, what? La Rochelle, a Protestant state within a state, found out that France's first minister, Armand Jean de Plessis, Duc de Richelieu et Fronsac, aka Cardinal Richelieu, was plotting to reduce the Huguenots' political influence. One of the Huguenots' leaders, Benjamin de Rohan, Baron de Soubise, made a preemptive strike by attacking Ile de Ré and then capturing the port and citadel of Blavet. Soubise was French, but King Louis declared this a foreign attack on France. He invoked the treaties with England and the Republic to send fleets to help him besiege La Rochelle. But Protestants helping a Roman Catholic king fight Protestants was a hard sell back home. English Parliament was mad at King Charles, and the Calvinist reverends preached fire and brimstone against the States General. Still, both countries wanted France's hands free to help them fight the Habsburgers and Spain, so they honored the treaties and sent fleets. On April 22, 1625, the doctors in The Hague could no longer help Prince Maurits and made way for the reverends. Johannes Bogerman, the chairman of the Synod of Dort, spent many hours at the prince's bedside and spoke of sin and forgiveness. Maurits knew he had committed many sins, but said God would forgive our sins in Christ's name if we sincerely repented. He hoped that his repentance was considered sincere enough for God. He was at peace in his belief the next day. With his sister Emilia von Nassau by his side, Prince Maurits of Orange, Count of Nassau, Grave, Meurs, Marquis of Flushing and Veere, Baron of Breda, etc., 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 died from liver carcinoma on April 23, 1625. He was 57 years old. His reputation had been completely destroyed by Johan van Oldenbarneveld's demise, and most historians cancelled him for centuries. No public statues were erected until recently. After 400 years, people began to realize that Maurits gave his all to save the Republic, and that his willingness to sacrifice his reputation, honor, and name to ensure the future of all the Netherlands should not go unrecognized. He had defended the Republic at every turn. He had kept his men safe and cared for them like a father. He had refused to sacrifice them in battles other generals would have waged for honor and glory. He honored his men without caring about his own honor. Prince Maurits, thank you for your service. The Orange Nassaus were traditionally buried in Breda, but with that city under siege, Maurits was buried next to his father in the Nieuwe Kerk in Delft after an elaborate funeral. It became the Orange Nassau Mausoleum. It was now up to Frederik Hendrik to carry on the war that his late father, Prince Willem of Orange, had started nearly 60 years ago. Frederik Hendrik was handsome, warm, friendly, and carried himself with confidence. Like his brother Maurits, he was an experienced and resourceful commander and a real soldier's general. He fought on the front lines to encourage his men and wore bright white feathers on his hat so everyone could see him on the battlefield. Everyone, including the enemy. The States General was like, not this again. Like his dad, F. Henri was a remarkably skilled diplomat, always seeking the middle ground. Frederik Hendrik was fortiter in re, suaviter in modo, forceful in action, gentle in manner. In short, he was the best of both worlds, and, a Hollander born and bred, he was very popular in the Republic. His motto, Patriae Patrice, for fatherland and father. The moment Prince Maurits breathed this last, Frederik Hendrik became the Prince of Orange and received all his brother's titles, properties and money. But he didn't inherit his military position nor his stadholderates. However, that same day, the States General took the unprecedented step of appointing Frederik Hendrik Captain General and Admiral of the Union. So instead of being in charge of each individual state's army, Frederik Hendrik became Captain General of all the combined armies and Admiral General of the Republic's war fleet. He would report directly to the States General instead of each of the states' councils. The States General delegated their tasks to a committee, so-called Secrete Besognes, or secret rigmarole. This committee, together with Frederik Hendrik, had the sole discretion to make tactical and even political decisions on behalf of the States General. That was the military thing sorted out. How about the prince's political power? Well, the title of stadtholder wasn't inheritable. Yet. Each state had to appoint its new governor separately and draw up the terms and conditions of the commission. For the moment, except for Count Ernst Casimir in Friesland, there was no stadtholder. But the prince's first order of business was the relief of Breda. Marquis Spinola's army, stationed around Breda, had grown to 80,000 men, with 25,000 guarding the supply routes. Prince Frederik Hendrik knew the city couldn't be saved. However, the new Captain General needed to show his face instantly, so everyone knew that the war continued with him at the helm. And they might get lucky. On May 2nd, 1625, the state's army of 40,000 foot and 7,000 horse split up. Ernst von Mansfeld and his ragtag mercenary army moved on Teteringen to create a diversion. Count Ernst Casimir sailed with a fleet from Roosendaal to supply Breda, and Frederik Hendrik planned a surprise attack on Terheiden to seize the Hartelbergen redoubt. The prince first marched to the tower of Oosterhout, drove out the Spanish spies stationed there, and set fire to the building, which spread to the church nearby. Oops. On May 15, 1625, early in the morning, Henry de Vere, the Earl of Oxford, led a two-pronged attack on the Spanish camp at Terheiden. The defenders of the first redoubt fled, but when the English got to the Hartelbergen redoubt, they were like, "We forgot something." Oh, storm ladders. Duh. Still, they crawled up the ramparts on hands and feet, but faced fierce Spanish pikemen and musketeers. The English were gaining ground, but then Maestre del Campo Paolo Baglioni appeared on the scene. The attackers quickly retreated along a narrow dike, aka target practice, and ultimately lost 400 men. The attack had failed, but Marquis Spinola was in shock. His circumvallation line had nearly been breached. He quickly beefed up his defenses, but Frederik Hendrik was told Breda was at a breaking point. The war room agreed. It was over. With his honor and authority adequately established, the prince sent an encrypted letter to his half-brother Justinus to surrender on the best possible terms, and left. Spinola intercepted the prince's message and sent the governor a letter to talk surrender, and another, and another. Finally, Justinus agreed to start negotiations. Spinola generously granted all the governor's terms save one, religious freedom in Breda. On June 5, 1625, the garrison marched out to Geertruidenberg with full honors of war. All the Nassau property was moved out of the Breda castle. Spinola strictly honored the treaty and kept all his men in line. But he had the turf ship that had surprised the castle 35 years earlier and was carried around town in the annual celebration of the event burnt, along with all the documents about the embarrassing ruse. The Governors-General Isabella came over to celebrate the glorious victory with her men. The Roman Catholics in Breda rejoiced, but after the Protestants left with their families, goods and skills, the place resembled a ghost town. Hundreds of houses stood empty for years. Spinola's win was celebrated big in Spain. However, Breda's capture failed to bring what King Felipe's first minister, Gaspar de Guzman Count of Olivares, had been hoping for. The Republic was not forced to negotiate for peace under favorable terms. Plus, this siege and Bergen-op-Zoom's failed siege had cost so much that the Spanish could no longer afford to do more. The Consejo de Estado reduced the military budget and told Spinola to wage a defensive war from now on. Meanwhile, the states got ready for an offensive war, but first the prince headed home to score him some stadholderates. When Prince Frederik Hendrik returned to The Hague, he faced a mess of tangled up political and religious mayhem, and his half-sister Emilia. She had just found out that Maurits had cut her from his will. She asked if the prince could help. He couldn't. Emilia's husband, Prince Emmanuel of Portugal, realizing there was no money in the relationship, quickly returned to the favor of the King of Spain. Emilia, feeling deeply betrayed by her husband, filed for divorce and moved to Geneva, where she died 4 years later, aged 59. The Counter-Remonstrants spent many a sleepless night worrying about Frederik Hendrik becoming stadtholder. Yes, the prince accepted Calvinism as the only official state religion, but it made it clear that there had to be room for others. But the Remonstrants weren't sure about him either. The prince was a total politique. He put the success and well-being of the Republic above all else, including religion. The situation was difficult to navigate, but F. Henri was good at this, really good. With patience and dexterity, Frederik Hendrik convinced the Arminians and the Gomarians to comply with his rule. Holland, Zeeland and Overijssel appointed the prince as their stadtholder with no changes to the instructions. Utrecht and Gelderland added a few extra clauses about the religion thing and picked him as well. But Groningen, with Drenthe in its wake, chose the deeply Calvinist stadtholder of Friesland, Count Ernst Casimir. Prince Frederik Hendrik created much-needed political stability to continue the war. He didn't withdraw the edicts forbidding Remonstrant services, but he didn't enforce them either. The stadtholder also ruled that troops should not be deployed to dissolve orderly gatherings of, say, Arminian services, but only in the event of public tumult and violence. He released Rombout Hogebeets from Loevestein Castle, though he died a few weeks later. He allowed his mentor, Reverend Johannes Uitenboogaard, to return from exile, though Frederik Hendrik didn't meet with him. And, with the apparently more tolerant climate, writers and artists dared to come out of the woodwork to express their views. Some claim that artist Rembrandt van Rijn's earliest known painting, his dramatic stoning of St. Stephen, was a commentary on Johan of Oldenbarneveld's fate. However, author Joost van den Vondel went a bit too far when he published his play Palamedes, in which Oldenbarneveld was murdered by a Prince Maurits like Agamemnon. Still, he got off with a fine. In June 1625, King Charles married Henriette Marie by proxy in the Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris. The king picked up his queen in Dover, but the massive welcome ceremony in London was cancelled. The city was on lockdown because of the plague. The king's quest to restore the Pfalz to Prince Frederik Hendrik's nephew, King Friedrich, hit a bit of a snag. The Republic refused to get directly involved in the Habsburg War. But in the end, England and the Republic signed the Treaty of Southampton, in which King Charles promised to fund a land army of 35,000 men to support the Republic's war against Spain. They would also raise an Anglo-Dutch armada to capture the Silver Fleet and invade Spain to further tank the Spanish economy. The king would have given more, but he was mad about the Amboina massacre, the trial and execution of English merchants caught in a conspiracy against the VOC on Ambon. The term was dragged out constantly. Could England pay back the Republic's loans? Amboina massacre. Could England release illegally confiscated VOC ships? Amboina massacre. The King of England stubbed his toe? Amboina massacre. However, Charles's promises weren't worth much without his Parliament's approval and money. As it turned out, Parliament refused to fund Charles's little pet projects abroad. Meanwhile, the Anglo-Dutch fleet arrived in La Rochelle to assist King Louis's fight with the Huguenots. After a rough start, the combined fleet defeated the Baron of Soubise off the Ile de Ré. The Baron fled to Falmouth, where King Charles promised him protection. The States General caved to public pressure and recalled their fleet. This made King Louis very angry, but François van Aersen smoothed everything over with great difficulty. And in the end, the States sold the King of France 6 unmanned ships to beef up his fleet. This made King Charles of England angry. He had long suspected that Cardinal Richelieu planned to eliminate Protestants not only in France, but in the rest of the world, and that he'd use the fleet to do it. Not true. Richelieu was only interested in suppressing the Huguenots' political power in France. Besides, the Protestant nations came in far too handy as chess pieces to checkmate the Habsburg rulers. In October, King Charles made the Duke of Buckingham commander-in-chief of the Anglo-Dutch Armada. Edward Cecil, a soldier, commanded 82 English ships, and Maurits's eldest bastard son, Lieutenant Admiral Willem of Nassau, Lord of Lalec, commanded 20 Dutch vessels. The Dutch cleared the way to Cadiz like a well-oiled machine, but the inexperienced and badly supplied Cecil didn't know how to or didn't dare attack Spanish ships for loot. And when he went on land and captured a castle, the English soldiers found the wine cellar and got very drunk. The commander quickly ushered most of them back on board and sailed away. Those left behind were killed by the Spaniards. Count Olivares swore vengeance, but the Corteses of Aragon, Catalunya and Valencia refused to fund a counter-armada to invade England. Everyone but King Charles blamed the Duke of Buckingham for the expedition's costly failure. Parliament was more convinced than ever to not fund King Charles's foreign pet projects. When they started an impeachment process against Buckingham, Charles dissolved Parliament. He was a God-appointed ruler and everyone should obey him. Since they wouldn't, he'd rule alone. In December 1625, the Duke of Buckingham showed up in the Republic with a massive entourage to deliver the ratified Treaty of Southampton. The Duke received a royal welcome, but how many men does it take to drop off a piece of parchment? Well, Buckingham had a few instructions. It became clear that King Charles considered the Republic a vassal state and felt he had the right to interfere in its internal affairs. The Duke also had to negotiate an anti-Habsburg league with the King of Denmark, the Dutch Republic, and hopefully other rulers like France, Sweden, Venice, and the Protestant Habsburg princes. On December 14, 1625, the Treaty of The Hague linking England, the Republic, and Denmark was signed. No one else joined in. King Louis and Cardinal Richelieu were busy fighting Huguenot rebels, and the King of Sweden, Gustav II Adolf of Sverige, was busy waging an on-again, off-again war with Poland. The Triple Alliance's wording made it look like three forces were teaming up to fight in the Habsburg Empire, but only the King of Denmark would have boots on the ground. The English and Dutch merely granted King Christian money, 30,000 and 5,000 pounds a month respectively. But King Christian and the Republic wondered how England was going to honor the alliance since Parliament wouldn't fund any of it. Now the real reason such a splendiferous party had been sent over to the Republic was revealed. Buckingham asked the Republic to loan King Charles £2 million, please, pretty please. The Duke had even brought the King's personal crown jewels as collateral. But the Republic had a war to wage and no money to spare. So Buckingham had to pawn off the jewels in the Dutch money market and return to England with minimal political success. Charles was mad at the States General for being so stingy. Hello, have you met the Dutch? Meanwhile, the Rochalois were starved out and surrendered to King Louis, and France and Spain ended the Valtellina War and the Genoese-Savoyard War with the Treaty of Monthon. The Spanish road would remain open for now. King Charles was even more convinced that Cardinal Richelieu was an enemy of the Protestants. He egged on the Huguenot rebels to fight their king and plotted to remove the cardinal from office. Well, take a number. The French nobility, Louis's mom Maria de Medici and his brother Gaston, the Duke of Orléans, were all involved in plots against Richelieu and the king. Meanwhile, the Dutch sent Charles a powerful message that he had nothing to say about the Republic's policies. They kicked the English from the Council of State. King Charles immediately looked for other ways to meddle in the Republic's politics. Hello, Prince Frederick Henry! King James had forged a personal relationship with Maurits by appointing him Knight of the Garter in 1613. King Charles would use Frederik Hendrik by offering him the same. Frederik Hendrik accepted, but the king misread the situation. Maurits had been an Anglophile. Frederik Hendrik was not. He wasn't a Francophile either. He was a Republicophile. He was only interested in the Republic's independence. No one would lord over them again. Meanwhile, Frederik Hendrik and his wife Amalia had a son on May 27, 1626. They named him Willem because, of course. The summer of 1626 was halfway over, but neither side was settling up. Holland, who paid nearly 60% of all war costs, refused to cough up the money. For the first time in decades, state soldiers hadn't been paid for 6 months. Prince Frederik Hendrik refused to move out until the money for the campaign was secured. Holland said they couldn't pay. Frederik Hendrik was convinced Holland simply didn't want to. But the cost to wage war had become immense. During Maurits's early years, entire rows of cities could be captured with 10,000 men, a handful of cannons, some boats and wagons, and volunteer farmers doing the digging. The art of warfare had progressed far beyond that now, and the European war next door had unleashed an arms race, doubling and even tripling military costs. Finally, in the middle of July, everything was sorted out, and the Prince of Orange entered the field. He headed for Emmerich and Rees to lure the Spanish away from Count Ernst Casimir, who arrived at Oldenzaal with 12,000 men and 18 cannons. The town's governor, Guillermo Verdugo, had a garrison of about 1,000 men. Ernst Casimir didn't need to construct a circumvallation line because a relief army could be seen arriving miles off. On July 25th, the cannons started firing 160 cannonballs a day as skilled engineers started digging trenches toward Oldenzaal. The town's canals, aka supply lines, were controlled by 2 sluice gates. So Ernst Casimir destroyed them with a few well-aimed cannon blasts. The water drained from the canals and the besieged were trapped. Verdugo, realizing relief was impossible, asked for terms and surrendered the city after a 10-day siege on August 1, 1626. The garrison left the next day with full honors of war. The Catholic religion was banned and the Plegelmus Church was handed to the Protestants. Since the city was too large for a small garrison and the states couldn't afford to leave a large force, they made the town useless. Ernst Casimir forced 2,000 citizens to fill in the canals and demolish the ramparts, gates and walls. He left parts of the old medieval wall and sections of the moat intact, so Oldenzaal could at least defend itself against mutinous troops. Overijssel was now Spanish-free, but the war had ravaged the area, with an estimated 20% of all farms in Twente destroyed. Meanwhile, Prince Frederik Hendrik's plans for surprise attacks on Sas van Gent and Hulst were discovered and cancelled. With the Dutch and English subsidies in his pocket, King Christian, Duke of Holstein, entered the Habsburg War with an army of 20,000 mercenaries. His army was large, but it was quantity over quality, with professionals commanding peasants. As Christian marched the main force to the Weser, Ernst von Mansfeld, supported by Christian von Braunschweig and Moritz von Hesse-Kassel, would attack General Wallenstein in Magdeburg. But in April 1626, Wallenstein pummeled Mansfeld's forces at Dessau Bridge. Hesse never showed up, and Braunschweig fell back to Wolfenbüttel, where he died of poison shortly after. He was 26 years old. In August, Johann ter Klaas, Count of Tilly, defeated King Christian at Luther am Barenberge before Wallenstein could even join in the fun. Mansfeld gathered a new army and drew Wallenstein away toward Hungary. He expected the support of Bethlen Gabor, the Prince of Transylvania, but the prince had a change of heart and made peace with Emperor Ferdinand. Mansfeld was forced to disband his troops and went to Venice, but he died in Bosnia, apparently of tuberculosis, in November. He was 46 years old. With Mansfeld and Braunschweig dead, all hopes rested on King Christian. The Duke King asked the Republic for more troops, but the States General had none to spare and refused to get dragged into the Habsburg War. And King Charles's 9,000 Scots could only slow Wallenstein down, not stop him. Christian's defeats allowed the Catholic League's army to enter Oost-Friesland. In fact, the entire imperial army got close to the Republic's border, too close. Prince Frederik Hendrik, who'd been organizing a military campaign for the southern Netherlands, had to change plans. He would besiege Grol, modern-day Groenlo, the only fortified city in the northern Netherlands still in Spanish hands. It was time to prove that Mooi Heintje was more than just a pretty face. But taking Grol wasn't going to be easy. The supply lines were long, and during the truce, Spinola had fortified and refortified the city with 20-foot-tall earthen ramparts, 6 bastions, 6 half-moons, and 6 ravelins. They had rerouted the Slinge River and effectively created a second moat around the city. It looked and felt impregnable. No one could even see the town behind the ramparts. On July 17, 1627, Prince Frederik Hendrik's army of over 15,000 foot and 4,000 horse disembarked near Emmerich and headed for Grol. Waiting for them in Grol was Commander Matthijs van Dulken, who led the Spanish garrison of 1,200 foot and around 300 horse commanded by Lambert Verrijken. They also armed the citizens. Van Dulken had 16 cannons, food and supplies aplenty, but he still ordered reinforcements of the reinforced defenses. The state's cavalry's advance under Herman Otto von Stirum, Count of Limburg and Bronkhorst, rode all night to block every major road leading to the city. Verrijken and his cavalry rode out for a surprise attack, but retreated when they realized they were massively outnumbered. Meanwhile, States troops seized villages in the area and secured the supply lines to Zutphen and Deventer. Troops were also stationed in Grave and Zaltbommel to intercept Count Hendrik van den Berg, who was in the south with the bulk of the Spanish Netherlands army. On July 20th, 1627, the main army arrived at Grol in the pouring rain and started working on the circumvallation line right away. They didn't even set up their tents and slept under the sky for 4 nights. Frederik Hendrik divided his troops by nationality and built 4 sconces to guard the roads: the Holland, Altena, Frisian and French. The English sconce a bit further away defended Frederik Hendrik's quarters. You can still visit the Engelse Schans in Groenlo. The town also hosts a massive international reenactment of this 1627 siege every other fall. 10 days later, the line was finished and the digging began. Several deep, wide and covered trenches zigzagged ever closer toward the city. At the head of each trench stood a 6-gun battery. On July 26th, the cannon started firing on Grol. Van Dulken returned fire, but the governor was shot in the shoulder 4 days later and went down. He had to recuperate and handed over command to his second, Verrijken. Day and night, Grol's cavalry charged the line, hoping to break through to get a message to Count van den Berg, but they didn't have enough men. Frederik Hendrik told the pioneers, "Hustle, hustle, hustle!" He was eager to wrap up the siege before van den Berg arrived with his army, because, like his brother Maurits, F. Henri was wary of being lured into a field battle. His mantra, "God save us from field battles." The prince promised a 3,000 gulden reward for whichever country's company got to the moat first. The diggers got super competitive. Meanwhile, the state's artillery blew up the sluice north of Grol to lower the water level in the moat so the besiegers could wade across. But it was still 9 feet deep. Count Hendrik van den Berg arrived at Grol with his Spanish relief army of 16,000 foot, 5,000 horse plus 1,800 German mercenaries. They fired the cannon 3 times to signal the Grol garrison their rescuers had arrived. Prince Frederik Hendrik sent troops to hold places like Lichtenvoorde and Lochem to prevent Van den Berg from getting a foothold in the area. The Count ended up making camp at Zwilbroek and sent scouts to find weaknesses in the defenses. On August 15, 1627, Van den Berg thought he had found a weak spot and prepared to deliver 700 soldiers and gunpowder to the city. During the night, 1,500 men attacked Count Ernst Casimir's camp, while Grol's cavalry also sortied. They demolished the state's palisades, scaled the ramparts, and unleashed a pike and gun battle. Frederik Hendrik grabbed 6 cannons and led his soldiers to charge the Spaniards. Sir Horace Vere came to the rescue of another quarter. When Grol's cavalry was driven back to town, Count van den Berg also fell back, with 9 wagons killed. The next day, the French braved Verrijken's cannon and musket fire, got to the moat first, and won the prize. The English reached the canal a day later and got a consolation prize. Both prepared to place mines under the first defensive wall, the Fos Bray, but the defenders brought out the Repel the Spaniard starter pack, patent pending, rebranded for the occasion as Repel the Rebel starter pack. They threw grenades, fireballs, and burning pitch hoops at the state's forces. Hendrik van den Berg sent 2 carrier pigeons with messages telling the city it was over. There would be no more relief. A French soldier shot down one of the pigeons, probably looking for a tasty snack, found the message and handed it to Frederik Hendrik. The prince sent French commander François de l'Aubespine, Marquis d'Hauterive, to convince Van Dulken to surrender. But Van Dulken, whose wound had healed, gave a manly answer. "No way, Jose," or "Federico Enrique." The siege continued. In the afternoon of August 18th, the English detonated a large mine and blew a massive hole in the Fos Bray. The Grol troops had to fall back, but shouted, "You may have the ramparts, you don't have the city." As the English troops climbed the city's earthen walls, Verrijken lay waiting with hundreds of musketeers and burning tar. He repelled the English 3 times. It was a massacre. Frederik Hendrik, with his trademark white feathers on his hat, entered the trenches himself to coordinate the storm. A bullet, probably meant for him, struck the temple of the man standing next to him, Maurits' son, Willem de la Lek. The lieutenant admiral dropped dead. He was 26 years old. Frederik Hendrik sent Hauterive once more to tell Van Dulken that he was now under attack from 3 sides and was ready to blow up 2 more mines. Hauterive also showed the commander the intercepted message urging Van Dulken to give up already. Van Dulken, short on men and guns with no hope of a relief, started negotiating. On August 19, 1627, he signed the treaty based on the one concluded at Breda and surrendered Grol. Spanish troops were allowed to leave with their weapons and possessions and were even given transportation. The citizens were left alone and kept their rights and privileges. The Republic burst out in jubilant celebrations at the first significant victory over the Spanish in years and gave Frederik Hendrik a hero's welcome in The Hague. And the foreign powers were impressed. Meanwhile, Spain was beyond bummed. The Castilian economy was down the toilet, royal debt spiraled ever higher, and the revenues from the Americas declined. Despite all of Olivares' financial reforms, King Felipe had declared royal bankruptcy. It was all yeas and cheers in the Republic, but the situation was still in Spain's favor. The 35,000 soldiers King Charles had promised never materialized, and an offensive war, this ain't. During the siege of Grol, Marquis Spinola had planned to invade South Holland, but the entrenchments built on Tolen weren't ready in time. A Spanish attack on Goes in Zeeland also failed. On December 29, 1627, Governors-General Isabella sent Spinola to Spain to argue for peace. Spinola didn't receive a warm welcome. Olivares held him personally accountable for the loss of Grol. It's Parma all over again. The deeply insulted Spinola raged against Olivares and vowed he would never return to the Low Countries unless his honor was restored and he was given all the money. He headed home to Italy. With Spinola apparently out of the picture, command of the Spanish forces in the Low Countries was shared between Carlos Francisco Coloma de Sá, Marqués de Espinar, who kept his eye on the French border, and Count Hendrik van den Berg, who fought the Republic. Coloma and van den Berg didn't get along. In fact, many suspected Count Hendrik was preparing to betray the Spanish Netherlands to his Nassau cousins. Some Spanish officers even refused to serve under him. It's Parma all over again. In 1623, Piet Pieterszoon Hein, or Piet Hein, entered the service of the newly founded Verenigde West-Indische Compagnie, the WIC, and became Vice Admiral. With the States General's letter of marque in his pocket, Hein sailed back and forth between Africa and the Americas and attacked all Spanish and Portuguese merchant vessels he encountered. On the first WIC campaign, Hein personally led a successful storm on the capital of São Salvador de Bahia de Todos e Santos, the Portuguese colony in Brazil. He also captured many places and vessels and confiscated a lot of loot. Don Fadrique de Toledo Osorio recaptured São Salvador a year later, but Hein was awarded a gold chain of honor on his return to the Netherlands, but he didn't receive a hero's welcome. That stung a bit. Hein was promoted to admiral for the second WIC campaign and got supreme command of all Dutch activities in the Americas. He wanted to intercept the Spanish silver fleet La Flota. However, the other company fleets failed to show up, and he reported, "It makes me sad to think about it, that I had to pass up such a beautiful opportunity due to the lack of assistance." Hein raided up and down the Brazilian coast and captured many ships, including 2 vessels from Angola carrying 300 enslaved people. Hein, a former slave, released them on the island of Itaparica, but he couldn't treat them for scurvy because he couldn't find any citrus fruit. FYI, at this time the WIC didn't trade in slaves, since an investigation into the practice determined this was unethical. However, this attitude would change a decade later. Hein fought his way back home and once more reported to the WIC, dropping off tons and tons of loot. Once more he received a gold necklace, but again, no hero's parade. That stung a bit. When it was time for a third campaign, Piet Hein was hell-bent on capturing that darn flota, the Silver Fleet. France continued to bulk up its navy while the English tried to block them at every turn. The two countries bickered their way into a war, and the States General tried to mediate between them. They didn't want Mom and Dad, France and England, to fight. Trade would suffer, and they'd lose support for their war from both. But the time for talks was over. The Duke of Buckingham convinced King Charles that Queen Henriette Marie's servants disrespected him, and the king fired them all. Henriette Marie's brother, King Louis, furious about the violation of the Marriage Act, seized 120 English ships in French harbors. So, Charles declared war on France. But since he hadn't asked Parliament's permission, he had no money. Still, he scraped together some funds and sent out the Duke of Buckingham with a 100-ship fleet and 7,000 men. But the siege of Saint-Martin-de-Ré was a bust, and the Duke returned home with nothing to show for it. Meanwhile, the citizens of La Rochelle once more revolted against the crown, and the French king once more besieged the city. Buckingham got right on assembling another fleet. The English were like, "We hate him. Like a mom and dad embroiled in a bitter divorce, England and France tried to get their kid, the Republic, to choose their side. England told them they owed it to the Protestants, and they owed it to the English because Amboina massacre. France tried to bribe the Republic with sweet talk, money, and an improved Compiègne Treaty, but the Republic had come of age and refused to pick a side. Meanwhile, the stepchild, the King of Denmark, was left in the lurch. By the end of 1627, Wallenstein occupied Mecklenburg-Pommern and Jutland, but he needed a fleet to take the Danish capital Copenhagen, so he besieged Stralsund, so he'd have a port to build it. The Dutch, who saw their Baltic trade in jeopardy, were like, "King Gustav, help!" King Gustav was like, "I got this." However, the Anglo-French War, the 80 Years' War, and the 30 Years' War were about to take a hard left turn because all hell broke loose in the Duchy of Mantua. Mantua and Monferrato were ruled by the House of Gonzaga. Both were part of the Holy Roman Empire and of great strategic importance because of the Spanish Road. In February 1627, Vincenzo II, the last Gonzaga male heir, became Duke of Mantua and Monferrato. He had no heirs and appointed his cousin, Charles Gonzaga, Duke of Nevers, a French peer, as his successor. There were other potential heirs, the Duke of Savoy from Monferrato and a distant Gonzaga cousin, Ferrante, Duke of Guastalla. Vincenzo died in December 1627, and Nevers arrived in Mantua a month later and requested Emperor Ferdinand's imperial recognition. Vincenzo's sister, Empress Eleonora Gonzaga, urged Ferdinand to grant it in exchange for Casale Monferrato. Oh, Eleonora was also Emperor Ferdinand's wife. However, the Duke of Guastalla protested, and the emperor confiscated both territories pending a final decision on the succession. None of the major powers were looking for a fight because everyone was waging wars everywhere else, but here we are. Spain, wary of French influence in the area, backed Savoy, who teamed up with Guastalla, with a large army. Nevers, backed by France and Venice, also raised a large force. And it was on. The political and religious landscape in the Republic was changing. A new kind of Arminianism was on the rise. Apart from a few religious aspects, it was mainly a political and secular movement. The new Arminians didn't want a public church, didn't want war, and longed to restore Holland's power over all. Even governments of major Gomarian cities like Amsterdam, Dordrecht, and several Zeeland towns embraced this new Arminianism. But the people weren't ready. So when 2 Arminian mayors were elected in Amsterdam in February 1628, the locals unleashed an iconoclastic fury on Remonstrant gatherings. The mayors ordered the Gomarian urban militia to intervene, but they refused. Things got restless, and when pamphlets circulated calling for a new alteration of Amsterdam, the city council asked Prince Frederik Hendrik to send troops into the city to arrest the dissidents. He did. Now people feared a civil war would break out, especially when Count Ernst Casimir publicly accused his cousin of being Arminian adjacent. Several towns in Holland started preparing for war, but all remained quiet. The people simply didn't care enough to fight, and the 2 stadtholders only focused on keeping the Republic safe. Meanwhile, King Charles of England figured that with France caught up in the Mantuan succession thing, this was the perfect time to break the siege of La Rochelle. Charles called together his 3rd parliament to get the money to launch a fleet to help the Protestant brothers and sisters abroad. The Commons presented the king with a long list of demands instead. Charles told them to fork over the cash first. When they didn't, Charles disbanded Parliament again. He'd go it alone. Again. The Duke of Buckingham assembled a fleet. Again. On September 2nd or August 23rd, 1628 English calendar, Buckingham passed a man on the street who thrust a knife into the Duke's side. The man left the knife in the wound and strolled off unnoticed. Buckingham pulled out the knife, fell down, and died. He was 35 years old. When a few Frenchmen were accused of the deed, the assassin came forward. He was English Army officer Lieutenant John Felton, who Buckingham had denied a promotion. When Felton heard the government wanted him gone, he decided to make it happen. When King Charles was told the news, he didn't appear troubled or concerned. He only ordered that the murderer be secured, and the fleet set sail. The 2nd English fleet arrived in La Rochelle in September, but failed to do any damage and left again. Meanwhile, Stralsund was under siege by General Wallenstein. In June, King Gustav of Sweden sent over several thousand troops to help the town. Wallenstein captured the outer works of the fortifications, but when more Swedish ships and troops arrived, the general lifted the siege on August 4, 1628. After recapturing Wolgast from King Christian, Wallenstein offered the Danish king a peace deal. Seizing all of Denmark wasn't worth the cost, and with Sweden revving up to join the mayhem, Wallenstein feared losing all conquered northern Germany. You see, King Gustav had received an extensive education about the new war methods that the Nassau clan had developed in the Republic in person from one of its architects, Johann the Middle of Nassau, Ernst Casimir's younger brother. If that newfangled army entered the war, Wallenstein could be toast. King Christian agreed to the talks, despite the Republic, England and France begging him to continue to be cannon fodder, fight the Emperor. Christian told them he'd think about it, but started talking. Meanwhile, King Charles figured peace was better for England as well. He'd returned the Pfalz to Friedrich via the diplomatic route and started negotiating for peace with Spain and France. In 1628, the Spanish didn't enter the field at all, so the stingy states decided that Prince Frederik Hendrik shouldn't either. In 1628, all the action was at sea. The state's admiralty sent out 35 warships, 5 yachts and 5 frigates to defend the coast from the English Channel to Norway against Dunkirk privateers. The Dutch United West India Company sent 3 fleets to the Americas: Dirk Simonszoon Uitgeest with 12 ships to attack Brazil, Pieter Adriaanszoon Ita with 12 to the Caribbean, and Piet Hein sailed to the Caribbean with a 31-ship fleet to capture La Flota. On board were 4,000 men and nearly 700 pieces of artillery. The flagship, the Amsterdam, with Captain Witte de With, alone had 50 cannons. The 1627 Spanish Silver Fleet, ready to head home, consisted of 2 fleets, the Tierra Firme, sailing from Panama's coast, and the Santiago from Mexico and Honduras. They would join up in Cuba and cross the Atlantic together. Hein's fleet crossed the ocean and docked at Blanquilla off the Venezuelan coast for supplies in July. After they left, they discovered that one of the ship's mates was missing. He was later picked up by the Spanish and spilled the beans about Hein's plans. The Tierra Firme fleet received the intel in time and remained in port. However, the Santiago fleet under Spanish Admiral Juan de Benavides Bazan set sail none the wiser. The WIC fleet lingered off the Cuban coast at the end of August, but the War Council got antsy. Hurricane season was around the corner, and the Silver Fleet was probably not coming anyway. Hein should give up and sail to Florida, but the admiral decided to remain for 2 more days. The next day, De With intercepted a Spanish sloop sent out to warn La Flota. So, the Silver Fleet was close. On September 7th, in the middle of the night, a Spanish ship, Nuestra Señora de la Concepción, nearly bumped into the Vitelleo and was seized. In the morning, the Dutch saw 20 vessels of the Santiago fleet downwind. A storm had pushed La Flota past Havana. Most Spanish were so startled that they surrendered immediately. Hein sent an interpreter who convinced the others to do the same. However, 4 large galleons, including Bazan's flagship Nuestra Señora de la Antigua, sailed into the Bay of Matanzas to take a defensive position. Let a massive sea battle commence. Alas, no. The ships ran aground and couldn't aim their cannons. Many crewmen disembarked, and Bazan also went ashore, supposedly to retrieve the crew and arrange for the transfer of the silver. Hein used the confusion and barreled down on the ships that evening, firing muskets, but no one was shooting back. Hein's crew couldn't climb aboard these massive ships, but they chanced on a rope hung over the edge of one of them. One sailor climbed up and then tossed more ropes to his buddies. The Spanish crew fled. Piet Hein claimed the vessels. He handed the remaining crew and their families some food and in perfect Spanish gave them directions to walk to Havana. Done and done. Barely a shot was fired. Just winds, tides, and luck. Hein had captured only a third of La Flota, but the loot was immense. Gold, pearls, fur skins, bales of indigo and cochineal, cases of sugar and silver, and so much more. The current estimates are that the total loot had a purchasing power of $500 million in today's dollars. On September 17th, Hein set sail for the Republic. Captain Salomon Willemszoon raced ahead and reached Rotterdam on November 15th. The States General and Prince Frederik Hendrik were overjoyed and used the news to get everyone enthusiastic about the war again. But Piet Hein wasn't home yet. When King Felipe heard about the Silver Fleet, he cursed those evil sea goblins and quickly assembled a large fleet in Cadiz to intercept the WIC fleet. But it was too late in the year to sail out. The king prayed the Dunkirk hijackers would capture Piet Hein instead. Meanwhile, Commander Johan Evertsen sailed out with the Zeeland squadron to keep the passage through the channel free for the WIC fleet. He fought his way through 27 Dunkirk privateer ships. Hein's fleet, plagued by storms and scurvy, reached England's Land's End on December 3rd, where Evertsen was waiting for him, and entered Falmouth Harbour. King Charles gave the WIC his guarantee that England would comply with the assistance treaty, but Hein had little faith in this because, Amboina massacre, and lay in the harbour with loaded cannons and burning fuses. England managed to resist temptation. But when Hein put some hides on the quay to prevent damage, he was told to pay nearly £300 of import duty. But he fought the charge, and won. He left England on January 3, 1629, and arrived in the Netherlands 6 days later. And he got a superhero welcome. That stung a bit. After being applauded by a crowd at the City Hall in Leiden, he said, "See how the people are now raging, because I bring home such great treasure, which I have taken little pains for. When I had fought for it and done far greater deeds than these, they scarcely looked at me." In February, he received another gold chain of honor from Prince Frederik Hendrik and a couple of $100 bonus. The crew was rewarded 17 months of extra wages. Well, the crew wasn't happy with that crappy reward and stormed the WIC office in Amsterdam, but the door held. Hein was also unhappy and feared that people would go after him or his wife. They'd already received threats. Meanwhile, Bathan was held accountable for losing La Flota and was eventually beheaded for dereliction of duty. Another sad loss occurred in relation to the Silver Fleet. Friedrich, expelled King of Bohemia, and his 15-year-old son and heir, Heinrich Friedrich, sailed out to check out the captured Spanish ships moored on the Ij River in Amsterdam. The royal vessel was sailed over by another and filled with water. The king was saved, but the crown prince and 3 noblemen drowned. A disgruntled Hein left the WIC in March, citing irreconcilable differences, but the States General didn't want to lose him. The prince made Hein Lieutenant Admiral of Holland and West-Friesland, the late Willem Lalec's position. He was the first non-noble to receive that rank. Hein immediately submitted a 10-point plan to improve naval governance, but the 5 admiralties rejected most of his suggestions. He also shared some ideas to improve the navy. One of his improved battle tactics, de Kiellijn, the line of battle, where ships attack in a line one behind the other for optimal use of the cannons, proved successful later, though he wasn't around that long. On May 29, 1629, Hein and his fleet departed Hellevoetsluis to take care of the Dunkirk privateers. On June 17th, he intercepted 3 Ostend ships. As was his custom, he shoved his ship, the Vliegende Groene Draak, between 2 vessels to fire broadsides simultaneously. But an 8-pound cannonball hit him in the left shoulder, killing him instantly. He was 51 years old. The battle wasn't lost because of the ship's captain, 31-year-old Maarten Harpetszoon Tromp, who witnessed the Gibraltar battle with his dad when he was 9. 2 vessels were taken, and Tromp ordered their crews hanged on the spot. Piet Hein received a very stately burial in the Oude Kerk in Delft, where a great tomb was erected in his honor. Don Gonzalo Fernández de Córdoba invaded Monferrato and besieged the Casale, one of Europe's largest and most modern forts. Spain thought taking Casale would be easy peasy, but the siege turned into another money pit. Things took a turn for the worse when in October 1628, La Rochelle surrendered, freeing up the King of France to intervene in the Mantuan Succession War full-time. Not so much to help the Duke of Nevers, whom the king considered a Habsburg subject, but to kick Spain while they were down. And Spain was down, way down. Due to its financial troubles, mass desertions plagued the fleets and the garrisons in the Spanish Netherlands. Count van den Berg didn't even have money to transport the supplies. Commander numero uno, Marquis Spinola, couldn't be persuaded to return to the Netherlands to help out. He told the court in Madrid to either conclude a truce or a peace, or send more money to the armed forces. Well, there was no money, and Olivares had to give the Council of State what they wanted, an immediate settlement with the Dutch. Governor-General Isabella was granted power of attorney to start talks for a 30-year ceasefire or even conclude peace on the 1609 terms. But Prince Frederik Hendrik and the States General figured Spain could wait. This was the perfect time to punch a hole in the line of Spanish forts that encircled the Republic. But they had to hurry before that Mantuan succession thing and the Danish intervention thing were over, and all the troops became available to descend on the Republic. Frederik Hendrik was like, let's go! But Holland was like, not so fast, bucko. The Arminian towns were glad to help, but the Contra-Remonstrant towns, fed up with the Arminian takeover of Holland, said there'd be no offensive until the present public religion and government had been set right. But Frederik Hendrik gave them the evil eye, and the States of Holland caved almost immediately. They also added 700,000 guilders to the 1 million already reserved in the war chest. Meanwhile, in March, King Louis of France crossed the Alps and forced a breakthrough at Susa. Savoy was forced to make a treaty with France, and Córdoba had to break off the siege of Casale. But King Louis had to return to France to deal with more Huguenot troubles, so Richelieu took over command duties to keep everyone in Italy in line. And in April, England and France concluded a peace. With the finances sorted out, the Republic recruited extra troops. But because of all the wars, Prince Frederik Hendrik couldn't get the numbers he wanted. On top of that, the King of Denmark, in the middle of peace talks, forbade Danish troops from enlisting. And the King of Sweden, preparing to enter the Habsburg War, demanded the Republic send him troops instead. In the end, the state's field army consisted of 77,000 men, but we're scraping the barrel here. The prince's mission was top secret, and no one had a clue what his target was. Everyone and their mother in the Spanish Netherlands gave their 2 cents. It was Dunkirk, Antwerp, Hulst, Sas van Gent, Wesel, Rheinberg or Lingen. Count Hendrik van den Berg bet on Venlo, while the government in Brussels believed that Breda was the most likely target, or 's-Hertogenbosch. This confusion was precisely what Frederik Hendrik was after, and he unintentionally made it worse. At the end of April, he assembled his army at the Schenkenschans, but bad weather stranded some troops around Nijmegen and Arnhem. Van den Berg now believed 2 armies were forming. Frederik Hendrik added to the madness by sending Count von Stierum to Lingen, Colonel Willem Pijnssen van der Aa to Wesel, and Lieutenant General Stakenbroek to 's-Hertogenbosch. He told each of them that they were scouting the actual target, so they didn't know the prince's plans either. On April 25th, the state's army of 24,000 foot and 4,000 horse, divided into 3 large units, crossed the Maas en Waal via ship bridges and joined up at the Mokerheide. Count van den Berg raced to Maastricht. Was that the target then? Nope. On April 28th at the break of dawn, Prince Frederik Hendrik and his army entered Brabant. On April 30th, Stakenbroek and his cavalry seized several towns and strategic places around 's-Hertogenbosch and blocked the road to Breda. So, 's-Hertogenbosch or Den Bosch or Bois-le-Duc was the target. Well, Den Bosch's governor, the experienced, aged in the war, brave and discreet 70-year-old Anthonie Schets Baron of Grobbendonck, was about 80% sure this was a fake siege. There was no way that the Swamp Dragon could be completely encircled. 's-Hertogenbosch's other name was the Virgin of Brabant because it had, never been taken. The government in Brussels also believed it was a ruse. Back in the day, Count Maurits had targeted Den Bosch only as a diversion. Dunkirk was the prince's real goal. They ordered Van den Berg to send some troops to that area. But Frederik Hendrik was dead serious about this place. Le Rempart des Belges in states' hands would create a spectacular breach in the Spanish line of forts. The 4th town in Brabant also came with a vast rural territory, the Meierij. But most of all, capturing La Ciudad la Más Católica would put a serious dent into the reputación so valued by the Spaniards. From there, the options were endless: Eindhoven, Helmond, Venlo, Weert, Roermond, Maastricht, and beyond. Grobbendonck commanded the largest garrison in the Spanish Netherlands, 2,547 foot and 4 squadron horse. It wasn't enough to defend all the city's defensive walls, most of which were old, sagging and crooked medieval fortifications, but there were plenty of new forts and hornworks to cover the town's weak spots, such as the Pettelaar, the Kleine Schans, also called St. Anthony after the governor, and the Grote Schans, or Fort Isabella. There was plenty of food and some ammunition, but the gunpowder was wet because swamp. But they vowed to defend the city against the heretics to the last. So bring it on, pretty boy. Hendrik van den Berg crossed the Maas at Maastricht with 23,000 soldiers and entered Liège to team up with the Walloons. But until people got paid, no one moved. Governor-General Isabella forced the southern states to pay more taxes and recalled her forces on their way to the Mantuan War. She pleaded with Emperor Ferdinand to send her troops to help her relieve Den Bosch. He was like, "Girl, give me a minute. I'm in the middle of peace negotiations with Denmark here." On May 3, 1629, after Frederik Hendrik had breakfast on a farm in Vught, he did a reconnaissance of the area to point out where the quarters would go. Count Wilhelm von Nassau-Siegen in Orten, Count Ernst Casimir in Hintham, Johann Wolfert van Brederode in Dungen, Frederik Hendrik in Vught, Colonel Pijnsen in Deuteren, and Lord Hemert and Count Albrecht Sousholms in Engelen. These quarters were linked up to form the enormous defensive lines. Under the watchful eye of skilled engineers, soldiers and farmers from South Holland and Gelderland added dikes, canals and windmills to drain the flooded lands. They diverted the Aa and the Dommel rivers and flooded the area outside the dikes as an extra defensive measure. They also dammed the river Dieze, the city's open sewage system. The stagnant, dirty water soon caused an outbreak of the plague, which killed many people in the town. The digging progressed at breakneck speed because, apart from a few stray shots from Fort Isabella, no one was shooting at them. On the night of May 3rd, 800 Spanish soldiers from Breda waded through the water in an unprotected area and entered the city. They were followed a few days later by another 45 men, the garrison of the previously captured Heeswijk Castle. In just under 3 weeks, Den Bosch was encircled at a speed that surprised both Grobbendonck and the state's deputies. Time for Phase 2, the assault. Grobbendonck expected 2 approach trenches, but Frederik Hendrik ordered 5, 1 from each quarter. It forced the defenders to divide their attention, which would wear them out. The prince exploited the rivalry between French and English soldiers by having them dig toward Fort Isabella and Fort Saint-Antoine respectively. Whoever got to their fort first, won. In the 3rd week of the siege, Den Bosch finally started firing back, and Grobbendonck ordered sorties from the town and the forts. His men destroyed defensive works, killed soldiers, spiked the cannons, and tried to defuse the mines. Sorties saved gunpowder, but were basically kamikaze missions. After an attack, the soldiers had difficulty climbing back into their forts. The state's musketeers picked off about a quarter of the troops. For the states, water was the real curse. Several approach trenches flooded so severely that they had to be abandoned. Meanwhile, Count Ernst Casimir's trench had almost reached the counterscarp of the hornwork of the Hinthamer port. But instead of storming the place, the Count changed directions and dug toward the simple medieval wall next to it. Frederik Hendrik did the same at the fiercely defended Great Hornwork. The prince then bombarded the Isabella and Saint-Antoine forts with 2 mortars to speed up their surrender. One struck the commander's house at Fort Isabella, where gunpowder barrels and grenades were stored. The spectacular explosion surprised both friend and foe. Half an hour after sunrise, June 18, 1629, the state's troops prepared to detonate a mine under the Isabella fort's bastion, but the defenders blew up a mine first. After the smoke cleared, the state's forces found no one inside. The next day, Fort Saint-Antoine was abandoned in exactly the same way. Despite all this, Grobbendonck kept his chin up. He lacked troops and ammo, but had enough food and expected a relief army soon. Meanwhile, Emperor Ferdinand redeployed his troops from Denmark to assist Cordoba to once more besiege Casale Monferrato. Isabella was like, "You, got any of them troops left for me?" Count Hendrik van den Berg had reluctantly accepted the poisoned gift of commanding the relief army. He felt 's-Hertogenbosch was already lost, but when the money arrived, he marched to Haren. Prince Frederik Hendrik sent Count Wilhelm von Nassau with 25 company foot and 3 squadron horse to the Hemertse Waard and 4 squadron horse to the right bank of the Maas. He ordered guard ships to patrol the river and inundated the land of Altena. However, Van den Berg went to Drunen. The puzzled state's army was forced to divide its attention. The Spanish captured the weakly defended castle of Boxtel, and the people in Den Bosch and everywhere else believed that now the king's people had entered the field, Frederik Hendrik was done. Bets were placed 4 against 5 at the Brussels Exchange that the prince would be killed or imprisoned that year. However, the Spanish, German and Walloon officers fought each other for the honor of leading the vanguard. Van den Berg, fed up with the constant bickering, said, "Why don't you all have a go?" Colonel Diesdorf and his 3,000 would break through the circumvallation line at the Dommel and bring soldiers into the city. A bit further north, the Duke of Bournonville with 4,000 foot and 7 squadron horse led an attack between the quarters of Brederode and Ernst Casimir, while the Baron de Beauvoir and his 3,000 attempted to break through at Pijnsen's quarter. But none of the attacks were executed properly. Hendrik gave up and retreated to Boxtel. Of the 23,000 men, he barely had 15,000 left, mostly because of desertion. Isabella asked cousin Ferdinand, "Give me them troops already." Ferdinand was like, almost there. The Roman Catholics believed the Habsburg War was over. Emperor Ferdinand also believed this and passed the Edict of Restitution. It required all lands taken from the Catholic Church after 1555 to be returned. Technically legal, but politically really dumb. It would change all state boundaries in North and Central Germany, deny the existence of Calvinists, and restore Catholicism in places where it hadn't been for nearly a century. Yeah, the man wasn't gonna stop now. A few weeks later, Wallenstein concluded peace with King Christian at Lübeck and basically forced Ferdinand to sign off on it. The emperor did a few weeks later and gave the Danish king an excellent deal. He restored most of his lands, but this wasn't out of the goodness of his heart. A weakened Denmark would fall prey to Sweden, which could cut off Habsburg's access to the North Sea. When the Dutch first heard of the peace, they thought it was fake news to scare them into breaking up the Den Bosch siege. When they got official confirmation on June 18th, they were sad. But Brussels and Spain were happy. The Imperial Army became available to intervene in the Republic and Mantua. However, a week later, France made peace with the Huguenots in the Peace of Alais, which freed King Louis up to intervene everywhere. On July 7, 1629, Emperor Ferdinand sent the captain of his guard, Count Ernesto Montecuccoli, and his 20-year-old nephew Raimondo, and 15,000 foot and 4,000 horse to Wesel to assist Count van den Berg. Count Johann von Nassau-Siegen, Ernst Casimir's nephew, was also sent over with 10,000 imperial forces. Johann once served in the state's army, but much to his family's shock, he had converted to Roman Catholicism in 1613 and joined the Habsburg army. All the Habsburg forces were paid by Spain to ensure their neutrality. The Montecuccoli family had earned a reputation as brutal warlords, while Ernesto was feared because of his unreasonableness and tyranny. So, fantastic! On July 21, 1629, the Count of Montecuccoli's Spanish/Imperial army arrived at Wesel. Everyone in the Republic freaked out. A few days later, Count Hendrik van den Berg moved on Grave. Everyone in the Republic freaked out. Prince Frederik Hendrik ordered Colonel Varik at Doesburg to Grave and sent Count van Stierum toward Arnhem. But the prince kept his eye only on Montecuccoli's force, because he didn't think the armies would act independently. Well, he was wrong. First, Van den Berg left the Prince of Barbançon and 6,000 soldiers entrenched in Heyen and headed for the Maas. Then the Count's advance, helped by a son of a local ferryman, crossed the IJssel at Westervoort near Arnhem. Everyone in the Republic freaked out. That night, Frederik Hendrik loaded 2,000 foot soldiers into wagons and ordered Otto van Gent, Lord of Dieden and Biesterveld, to take them plus 7 squadron horse to the IJssel. However, Van Stierum at Arnhem didn't wait for these reinforcements. Early morning, July 24th, he attacked the Spanish advance with 2,000 men. They were cut to pieces. Half of Stierum's men were dead, wounded or captured, and the bridgehead was still firmly in Spanish hands. Meanwhile, Frederik Hendrik expected the main army to cross Neerwijk by Duurstede and sent Colonel Auterive there. His troops, assisted by local farmers, guarded the river as far as Vianen. But the army didn't cross there. Count van den Berg unexpectedly moved deeper into the Republic and captured Fort Delenswaard near Dieren to better secure his supply lines. Then he built a bridge on stilts. On July 31st, Montecuccoli crossed it with 17,000 men. Everyone in the Republic freaked out. After another rowdy war room meeting, people really didn't trust Van den Berg, the Count divided the army into 3 parts. Montecuccoli moved on Amersfoort and Harderwijk to get access to the Zuiderzee. From there, he'd take Utrecht and Naarden and then get the keys of Amsterdam that Van den Berg so craved. The Second Army was led by Juan de Velasco y Llano, Marqués de Belvedere, Conde de Salazar. He was the son of the recently deceased Don Luis de Velasco y Velasco. With Colonel von Dulken and 6,000 men, Salazar would attack Hattem to threaten Friesland. The Count stayed in Dieren to cover the retreat, with Count Johann of Nassau-Siegen's 10,000 still underway. The Spanish believed this attack in the heart of the Republic would cause great panic and lure Frederik Hendrik away from Den Bosch. They were half right. Panic erupted on the Veluwe, and folks fled en masse into the poorly defended and badly supplied towns. But the prince refused to break off the Den Bosch siege. He said that he'd rather to want to die than to break up a siege which had already cost 200 dearly, and to which his honor and that of the state were bound. F. Henri told everyone to never fear. They got this. He said, it's not like he can do much harm. At most he'll burn a few villages and plunder some unimportant places. I'm sure the locals were like, thanks man, thanks for having our backs. Also, God save us from field battles. The prince planned to lock the invaders on the Veluwe and starve them out. He told Gelderland, Utrecht and Overijssel to order the peasants to enter the towns with their provisions and cattle and destroy what they couldn't take with them. They should also disable brewing kettles and windmills. A starved army can't march. However, that move would also lead to starvation among the locals, so the destruction order was mostly ignored. Frederik Hendrik sent Count Ernst Casimir with 50 company foot and 14 squadron horse to occupy Doesburg, Zutphen and Deventer to stop the Spanish advance. Ernst Casimir's fierce presence calmed everyone down a little. Meanwhile, the States General shifted focus to protect Utrecht and Holland. They ordered local men between 18 and 60 to report with 6 days of food to build a defensive line. Villagers were assigned guard duty and lands were inundated. So they waited. And waited. And waited. Yet the Spanish imperial forces moved very slowly. The Count of Montecuccoli waltzed right over the newly built defenses and on August 13th at 6 a.m. claimed the poorly defended Amersfoort. Governor Tertullian van Dorp had 6 company foot and some horse. He had provisions and gunpowder, but only 4 cannons, without gun carriages. Also, the city's defenses weren't up to standards. All the money had been spent on the fortifications of the city of Utrecht. The city government feared holding out would lead to plunder, massacre, and outrage, but the population wanted to fight and were ready to riot. However, on August 14th, Amersfoort surrendered. Huis ter Eem, the castle that defended the connection between the city and the Zuiderzee, was also taken. Despite a carefully drafted surrender agreement, Montecuccoli allowed his men to do whatever they wanted. Van den Berg reprimanded him, but Montecuccoli didn't understand. They occupied an enemy city. The Count explained it was merely a reduction. The citizens were not the enemy. Salazar and Van Dulken conquered the castles of Nijenbeek, Buckhorst and the Weihe Redoubt on their way to Hattem. But Hattem was ready for them. Legend tells of how the brave citizens defended the town against all odds, but Governor Adriaan Slijp told a different story, or rather, no story at all. The city was surrounded, but neither Salazar nor Van Dulken did anything noteworthy. Hattem and Harderwijk, which had also been claimed, didn't surrender. Amersfoort's fall caused downright panic in Utrecht. Ferries worked overtime taking people, cattle and baggage across the river. The sheer amount of refugees then caused panic in Holland. The Jesuits loudly proclaimed that the end of the Republic was nigh. The States General and the Council of State moved their meetings to Utrecht to restore the broken morale. They hired 13,000 more soldiers, plus troops which had been in Danish service. King Gustav also sent men. The Dutch United East India Company hired 1,000 men and sent them to Utrecht. The state's army grew to its largest size ever, over 90,000 men. Meanwhile, the governor of Breda, Baron of Balançon, got permission from Count Hendrik and Governess-General Isabella to gather an army to break the siege at Den Bosch from the south. But due to infighting, they got stranded halfway there. When Montecuccoli's Croatian mercenaries burned Hilversum to the ground and blazed and flattened their way to the gates of Naarden, the States General retreated to Holland. Johann of Nassau arrived in the middle of August. With the army considerably strengthened, Hendrik van den Berg prepared to launch a few new campaigns. Everyone in the Republic freaked out again, but the besiegers at Den Bosch didn't move an inch. Frederik Hendrik didn't have to attack the giant Spanish imperial army. All he had to do was cut off their supply line. And that's what they would do. In greatest secrecy, Prince Frederik Hendrik withdrew 2,800 soldiers from various garrisons and sent them to the Schenkenschans area. Count Hendrik van den Berg believed the rumor that the Lord of Dieden spread that they would attack a convoy, but Dieden was going to take Wesel. He'd been chatting with some Wesel citizens who told him that many troops had left the town to join Van den Berg's campaign, and that the town's ambitious new governor, Francisco Lozano, had pulled down 2 stone towers to make way for improved earthworks. The breach in the defenses was merely covered by palisades. Dieden led his army to Wesel, where he would team up with Bredevoort commander Wolf Mieslich and his 600 men. The weather was terrible, the night was dark, and Dieden arrived at the rendezvous point late, 2 hours before dawn on August 19, 1629. Mieslich, fearing he'd been discovered, had already retreated. Still, Dieden had 2 guides lead him and his men through the palisaded breach. They captured the guards and opened the gates for the cavalry. The Spaniards bravely defended the place, with Lozano and some Germans resisting the longest. But after about an hour and a half of bloody street fighting, Wesel surrendered. Mieslich, hearing the firing, turned back and seized the redoubts which the Spanish had built on the Lippe River. All captives were ransomed later, but the Spaniards beheaded Lozano and his sergeant major for failing their duty. The loot was awesome. Many commanders, including Van den Berg and Montecuccoli, had stored their valuables in Wesel on their way into the Veluwe. The States maintained religious freedom in the town and left Dieden in charge. Despite the city's pleas for neutrality, a States garrison remained until 1672. With Wesel in States' hands, the Spanish Imperial Army lost their only supply line. Van den Berg knew that if the army remained on the Veluwe any longer, it would be reduced to nothing. At the end of August, Amersfoort and other captured places were abandoned, and the imperial forces marched back to Germany, burning everything on their way. Van den Berg returned to Brabant with the loot, while Count Johan remained at the IJssel, facing off with his uncle Ernst Casimir. Both armies sacked the area completely. When Frederik Hendrik got the message that Wesel was captured, he ordered a spectacular celebration to destroy the besieged morale at Den Bosch. After a signal from the prince's yacht on the Maas, all cannons fired in turn around the circumvallation line clockwise. Then the musketeers fired, bonfires were lit, and soldiers waved flaming torches, making it seem as if the whole army was on fire. Meanwhile, Frederik Hendrik sent Van Stakenbroek and the Duke of Bouillon with the cavalry to repel a Spanish attempt to pierce a dam that kept the camp dry. Bouillon ran them off to Breda, while Van Stakenbroek chased away the garrison of the castle of Eindhoven, returning that city to the Republic. In the Mantuan succession thing, the siege of Casale dragged on and on. King Felipe brought in a more potent general to replace Córdoba, Marquis Ambrogio Spinola. Everyone expected him to wipe the floor with the French, but Casale remained a tough nut to crack. As the state's trenches inched closer to Den Bosch, resistance from the town grew more fierce, and the cost spiraled out of control. The pioneers, exposed to the most danger, had to be paid up to 10 times their usual wage. Prince Frederik Hendrik's army, scattered around the Republic, was down to about a third of its original strength. However, he ramped up the shellings at the city from all directions. It drove the citizens mad. The city returned fire, but we shot 1 shot, the enemy did 10 shots against. By the end of August, the state's trenches had almost reached the Den Bosch walls at 3 points. A storm on the Hintermarijnd was imminent. The city council feared the town might be taken by force, which meant plunder, murder, and outrage. The people, though loyal to Mother Isabella, simply wanted the siege to end. Bishop Ophovius intervened and urged Grobbendonck to surrender, but the governor worried about his reputation and planned to hold out as long as possible. "I want to fight me to death," he proclaimed. He even considered surrendering part of the town, but the citizens threatened to riot, and the soldiers stopped fighting. Plus, the town's gunpowder was nearly gone. On September 4th, they had 113 kegs left, which, at 20 a day, would last another 5.5 days. On September 10th, at 4 o'clock in the morning, Prince Frederik Hendrik detonated 2 mines under the last defensive work in front of the Vugtepoort and captured it. On September 11th, a huge mine blew away a large section of the bastion, a breach. The siege of 's-Hertogenbosch was over. The city council surrendered the next day and presented a list with 43 demands. Virtually none were honored. The population would have freedom of conscience, but open Catholic worship wasn't allowed. Women clergy could stay, but everyone else had to go. The captured area fell under the direct administration of the States General, so-called Generality lands, and had no representation in the States General, courtesy of Holland. The city council had no choice but to sign the Lecture Capitulatiën on September 14, 1629. On September 18th, 1,100 baggage wagons, followed by officials and clergy, artillery, 1,100 foot soldiers, 4 squadron cavalry, Grobbendonck and 12-ton ammunition left the town. The exodus was so impressive that it drew thousands of siege tourists from Dordrecht, Nijmegen, even as far away as Amsterdam. Grobbendonck said, "It must be very quiet in Holland, now that so many fools have left." Prince Frederik Hendrik had slain the swamp dragon and punched a hole in the line of Spanish forts. He then sent out several troops to capture a bunch of places in the Rhine area. The foreign powers were in awe of the Republic and Prince Frederik Hendrik, whose reputation went through the roof. The states were so overjoyed that they appointed the prince's son, Willem, general of the cavalry. The kid was 4 years old. The people in the southern Netherlands were furious. They accused the Spanish councillors in Brussels and Count Hendrik van den Berg of treason. The government in Madrid was bewildered. Their grief was intensified by the death of one of their chief generals. On September 19, 1629, at the siege of Casale, Ambrogio Spinola, Marques de los Balbasis, died, ill and destitute, muttering the words honor and reputation. He was 60 years old. Rest in peace, brave warrior. King Felipe feared Frederik Hendrik, the Stedendwinger, conqueror of towns, would now seize all the Spanish Netherlands. Well, let's find out.